The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Birds chirped, children played in the yards, and the world seemed at peace. For the protagonist and their family, it was just another Saturday afternoon. Their backyard barbecue was in full swing. Laughter filled the air. The smell of grilled food lingered on the breeze, and their elderly grandfather, newly moved back into town, sat comfortably in a chair, enjoying the warmth of the sun. He had spent the past few months settling into his new home, finally finding peace after years of living away from his family. But peace, it seemed, was a fragile thing. As the protagonist flipped burgers on the grill, they noticed a figure approaching from the corner of their eye. Sharp, well-dressed, and exuding an air of authority. It was Karen, the newly appointed president of the neighborhood HOA, with her thick glasses perched precariously on her nose, her lips always drawn into a tight, disapproving line. There was something about her presence that made the air feel heavier, as if the moment she arrived, a cloud settled over everything. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was a self-made tyrant who believed the rules of the HOA were more like laws from a distant kingdom, and she, its queen. As Karen approached the family's gathering, the laughter faltered, and an uneasy silence took hold. The protagonist stiffened, exchanging an uncomfortable glance with their parents. What was she doing here? She didn't usually make casual visits unless she had something to say, and no one ever looked forward to those conversations. "Hello, everyone." Karen's voice sliced through the air, smooth but cold. She flashed a thin smile, though it never quite reached her eyes. "Lovely day for a barbecue, isn't it?" No one responded immediately. Instead, the protagonist's father nodded awkwardly, offering a weak, yeah, it's a great day." Karen took a slow, deliberate step closer to the table where the grandfather sat, eyes narrowing as she scrutinized his every movement. The older man, sensing her gaze, looked up, his warm, wrinkled face full of a quiet dignity. He smiled at Karen, as though trying to ease the tension, but she wasn't having it. "Your grandfather seems out of place here," she said abruptly, not even bothering with the pleasantries. Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as if she were inspecting a piece of trash someone had mistakenly left on the sidewalk. "Tell me, is he really supposed to be living here?" The family froze. The question, though casually posed, felt like a thunderclap in the middle of a serene afternoon. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. What was she implying? Karen's gaze didn't leave their grandfather's face as she continued. "I don't mean to be rude, but I'm afraid I'll have to insist that we verify his identity, perhaps through a simple DNA test." A stunned silence followed. The words seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating, each one heavier than the last. The protagonist blinked, trying to process what Karen had just said. A DNA test. What did she mean by that? Was this some kind of joke? But no. Karen's eyes were as cold as ever, her expression unyielding. "To ensure everything's legitimate," she added, her words dripping with insincerity, as if she was granting the family an immense favor by even suggesting such a thing. The protagonist felt their blood run cold. What had just happened? This wasn't just a casual remark. It was an accusation, an attack on their family, a demand to prove their very right to exist in this neighborhood. Before anyone could respond, Karen's voice cut through again. "I'm sure the other neighbors would appreciate the transparency. After all, we can't have anyone freeloading here, can we?" The stifling tension thickened, and the protagonist's hands tightened around the spatula in their grip. This wasn't a random comment. This was a deliberate move, a power play by Karen to establish her dominance in the neighborhood. And it was a fight she clearly wasn't planning to back down from. The air crackled with an unbearable sense of urgency. What now? The protagonist could feel their heart pounding, their thoughts racing. This had just gone from a simple neighborhood barbecue to a battle for their family's reputation, their right to stay in their own home. How would they respond to this audacious demand? And more importantly, why was Karen doing this? It wasn't just a random accusation. It was the beginning of something much darker. The days following Karen's outrageous DNA test demand felt like an unrelenting storm that wouldn't pass. At first, the family tried to brush off her behavior, thinking it was an isolated incident. Maybe she was just having a bad day, a moment of insanity that would fade with time. But Karen was anything but fleeting. Her relentless pursuit began to spread like wildfire. The next morning, the protagonist woke to find a letter in their mailbox, a thick envelope with the HOA's official seal stamped across the front. The handwriting was meticulous, almost cruel in its precision, and the words inside were no less damning. In light of recent inquiries regarding the residency of your grandfather, the Homeowners Association requires that you submit documentation verifying his relationship to you. Failure to comply will result in further action, up to and including legal measures. The letter was formal, calculated. It was clear that Karen had pulled every string she could to make sure this wasn't just a passing nuisance. She had gone above the HOA's usual scope, escalating her demand from a casual remark to something that felt far more sinister. The protagonist's stomach churned. Legal action. Over what? All they had done was move their grandfather into their own home, seeking to care for him in his old age. Was that a crime now? The family gathered to discuss their options. The protagonist's father, normally calm and composed, was visibly shaking with anger. "This is insane," he muttered, pacing back and forth. "What right does she have to demand anything from us?" But as the words left his lips, a sinking feeling settled in the pit of his stomach. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about her influence. She had carefully positioned herself in the HOA as a puppet master, pulling strings and making everyone bow to her whims. As the days wore on, Karen's harassment intensified. It wasn't just the letters anymore. Now she was showing up at all hours, knocking on the door, making passive-aggressive comments whenever she saw the family outside. One afternoon, the protagonist went out to take out the trash and found Karen standing at the end of the driveway, arms crossed, her sharp eyes scanning every detail of the house like a hawk. "I'm just checking in," Karen said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Making sure everything is in order. You know, the neighborhood can't afford to have people who don't belong here." The subtle threat in her words was unmistakable. But the tension didn't stop there. Karen began to spread whispers to the neighbors, casting doubt on the protagonist's family. She told anyone who would listen that the grandfather had mysterious origins and was probably a fraud, someone who didn't belong in their respectable neighborhood. No one was immune from Karen's prying eyes. No one was safe from her attempts to sow discord. The protagonist could feel the weight of it all pressing down. Each encounter with Karen left them feeling more and more isolated. Why was she doing this? The question echoed through their mind with growing urgency. Was she just a petty, power-hungry woman who couldn't stand anyone standing in her way? Or was there something more behind her actions? As the days blurred together, the protagonist noticed something else, something that sent a chill down their spine. Neighbors who had once smiled and waved now avoided eye contact. Conversations paused when they walked by. The sense of unease was palpable. It wasn't just Karen anymore. She had turned the entire neighborhood against them, weaponizing her position in the HOA. The family was being slowly and methodically isolated. But amidst the mounting pressure, something in the protagonist snapped. They knew they couldn't just sit back and let Karen destroy their family's reputation. They needed to fight back. But how? The HOA was her territory, her kingdom, and she wasn't going to give it up without a fight. The protagonist decided that if Karen wanted a fight, they would give her one. But this time, it wouldn't be a fight of accusations and wild demands. This would be a battle of secrets, of exposure, one that would destroy Karen's empire, piece by piece. But there was a catch. Karen had no idea that the protagonist was already one step ahead. The question lingered in the protagonist's mind like a dark cloud. What had Karen done in the past that might give them the upper hand? It was time to find out. The protagonist sat at the kitchen table, the morning sunlight spilling through the windows, But inside, the mood was anything but warm. Their fingers drummed nervously on the table, the clinking of a coffee cup breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the house. The letter from the HOA was still sitting in front of them, a symbol of everything they were fighting to keep intact: their home, their family, and their dignity. But as the words on the paper seemed to blur together, the protagonist felt the weight of the decision they now faced. Their parents were in the living room, speaking in low, tense tones, trying to decide what to do next. Every suggestion so far felt wrong. Ignoring Karen wasn't an option, and fighting back could spark an all-out war. The entire neighborhood seemed to be divided, with Karen at the center of it all, whispering her venom into the ears of anyone who would listen. Even people they'd considered friends now looked at them with suspicion. Could they trust anyone? The protagonist's father entered the kitchen, his expression drawn tight with frustration. "We can't just let this go on," he said, his voice cracking with anger. "But I don't know how to deal with her. She's got the HOA in her pocket." "She's not just targeting Grandpa, though," the protagonist's mother added, walking in behind him, her face pale with worry. "This is about control, about power. She wants to break us down, one person at a time." The words stung, but they were true. It wasn't just about a DNA test. It was about Karen's need to dominate, to prove that she could bend anyone to her will. And now she had chosen them as her victims. The protagonist clenched their fists, feeling a surge of frustration. The more they thought about it, the more Karen's actions seemed personal. Why this family? Why their grandfather? Hadn't their grandfather been a long-time, respected resident in this neighborhood before he'd moved away? Hadn't he always been a quiet, honorable man? "Maybe we should just cooperate," the protagonist suggested hesitantly, but even as they said it, they could feel the idea fall flat in the air. The thought of giving Karen what she wanted, letting her dictate their family's worth, made their stomach churn. But what other choice did they have? Their mother shook her head, the look in her eyes firm. "No, we cannot let her win. We cannot let her take control of this family, of our home. If we do that, then what's next?" That was the question, wasn't it? If they gave in to Karen now, what would stop her from coming after them again? What if she decided to challenge their right to live in the house altogether? The protagonist's father let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the decision was too much to bear. "She's already turned the neighborhood against us. Every time she sends those letters, it's like she's tightening her grip." Suddenly, a spark of clarity hit the protagonist. They couldn't win this with fear or submission. Karen's reign of terror over the neighborhood was rooted in one thing: her power. If they were going to fight back, they needed to find a way to take that power away from her. But how? What could they use against her? "Wait," the protagonist said, their voice cutting through the tension. "What if we dug into her past? Maybe we can find something that shows she's been abusing her position, something that could make everyone see her for who she really is." Their parents fell silent for a moment, the idea hanging in the air. It was a risky move. Karen had built her fortress of influence by staying one step ahead of everyone. But there was something in the way the protagonist spoke, a fire that hadn't been there before, that made their parents look at each other with renewed hope. "You think she's hiding something?" their mother asked, her voice full of a cautious but growing hope. The protagonist nodded, their mind racing. "She's been too confident, too sure of herself. That's what I don't get. Maybe she's hiding something big. We need to find out what." For the first time in days, the air felt lighter, the sense of defeat lifting ever so slightly. It was a dangerous path, one that could lead to more confrontation, but it was the only option left. They would dig into Karen's past, find the skeletons she'd buried, and use that knowledge to turn the tables. If Karen thought she could control them, they were about to show her how wrong she was. As the protagonist began to plan their next move, they knew one thing for sure. It wasn't just about defending their family anymore. It was about taking back control of their lives. and putting an end to Karen's reign of terror before it was too late. The house was eerily quiet that night, the kind of silence that only comes when a storm is on the horizon. The protagonists sat hunched over the kitchen table, their laptop open in front of them, the glow of the screen casting long shadows across the room. Their parents had retired to bed, exhausted and tense, but the protagonist couldn't sleep. Not with everything at stake. Not with Karen breathing down their neck, threatening to rip their family apart. As the hours ticked by, the protagonist pored over everything they could find on Karen. HOA records, old neighborhood newsletters, even social media posts, anything that might give them a lead. The task was daunting, and for a moment, they wondered if it was even worth it. Could they really find anything that would bring Karen down? But just as they were about to give in to frustration, their screen flickered, and a name appeared in the search results. Karen Anderson. Fraudulent claims and misuse of HOA funds. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the break they needed. They clicked the link with trembling hands and found an old article buried deep within a local news archive. It was a story from years ago, detailing a scandal that had rocked the very community Karen now dominated. Karen, it seemed, wasn't always the perfect HOA president she portrayed herself to be. In fact, her rise to power was built on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and questionable dealings. The article described how Karen had once been involved in a shady financial scheme, funneling HOA funds into her own pockets under the guise of neighborhood improvements. When the truth had come out, she'd managed to escape any real punishment by using her connections and playing the victim card. But there was more, much more. The protagonist's eyes widened as they skimmed through the rest of the article. Karen had been involved in multiple other disputes, each one conveniently swept under the rug. There was mention of harassment, falsifying documents, and even threatening other residents who dared challenge her authority. It was a web of deceit so tangled that it was hard to believe it had gone unnoticed for so long. But now the protagonist had the proof. They weren't just fighting back with words. They had a weapon, something that would expose Karen for the fraud she truly was. The suspense was unbearable as the protagonist began to plan their next move. How would they use this information? Karen had spent years building her empire, but this was her Achilles heel. She had hidden behind a veil of respectability, but now they could pull back the curtain and reveal the truth. The question was, how could they make sure the truth would stick? There was only one answer. They needed to take the fight straight to the HOA board. If they could expose Karen's past right in front of the people who had blindly followed her, they could dismantle her reign piece by piece. But they would have to be careful. The last thing they needed was for Karen to spin the story in her favor again. The protagonist's mind raced as they started to draft a letter, carefully selecting the evidence they would present. The handwriting was steady now, a reflection of the calm determination that had settled in their chest. This wasn't just about proving their grandfather's place in the neighborhood anymore. This was about taking Karen down, about stopping her from hurting anyone else. As the protagonist prepared their plan, they couldn't help but wonder what Karen would do when the walls came crashing down around her. Would she try to fight back? Would she double down on her lies? Or would she finally be exposed for the manipulative fraud she truly was? It didn't matter. The storm was coming, and they were ready to face it head-on. The suspense swelled as the protagonist hit send on the email, sending the evidence straight to the HOA board members. Now all they could do was wait, and pray that the truth would be enough to topple the queen of their neighborhood. The wait felt endless. The protagonist paced the kitchen, their fingers trembling slightly as they checked their phone for the 100th time. It had been 48 hours since they had sent the damning email to the HOA board members, a calculated gamble that could either destroy Karen's iron grip on the neighborhood or escalate the battle into something even uglier. They couldn't afford to make a mistake, not with everything on the line. Just as the protagonist was about to give up on the silence, a phone call lit up their screen. It was from their father, his voice on the other end full of urgency. "You need to get over here." "Now," he said, barely holding back a mix of frustration and disbelief. "Karen called an emergency HOA meeting for this afternoon. It's going down today." The protagonist's heart skipped a beat. It was happening. They threw on a jacket and rushed out the door. The house was alive with the low hum of tension. Every footstep heavy, every breath drawn in anticipation. The protagonist's parents were already getting into the car when they arrived, their faces tight with worry. "Karen's going to spin this," the protagonist's mother muttered, her voice strained. "She'll use everything she can to make us look bad. We can't let her get away with it." The protagonist nodded, their thoughts racing. The email they'd sent wasn't just an accusation. It was a battle cry. They had given the HOA board the ammunition they needed to take Karen down, but there was no telling how she would retaliate. The drive to the HOA building felt like it took an eternity, the weight of what was coming pressing down on them. As they arrived, they could already see the small group of neighbors milling around outside, murmuring to each other with nervous energy. Karen was at the center of it all, standing tall, her smile as cold and calculated as ever. She looked almost triumphant, as if she already knew she'd won. But the protagonist wasn't about to let her have the final say. The meeting room was cramped, filled with the hum of whispering voices as the neighbors took their seats. The HOA board members sat at the front, looking uneasy but attentive. And there, perched in her usual position of power, was Karen, her eyes scanning the room with a look of smug authority. When the protagonist entered, the room fell silent. All eyes turned toward them. The tension was palpable. Karen's lips curled into a tight smile. "Ah, the troublemakers," she said sweetly, her voice carrying the subtle venom that only she could manage. "I've been expecting you." The protagonist's stomach churned, but they held their ground. They walked to the front. The evidence, the truth, now in their hands. The weight of it pressed against their chest, a promise of reckoning. "We have something we'd like to present," the protagonist said, their voice steady but their heart hammering in their chest. They looked directly at the board members. "Something you all need to see." They pulled out a stack of papers, the damning articles and documents that exposed Karen's past, her fraudulent activities, and her history of manipulation. With each page they revealed, the room grew quieter, the faces of the board members shifting from uncertainty to shock. The truth was undeniable. Karen's carefully constructed persona began to crack. "Karen Anderson isn't just a neighborhood leader," the protagonist continued, their voice gaining strength. "She's a liar, a manipulator, and the truth is right here." Karen's face turned pale as the board members read the evidence, her mask slipping just enough for everyone to see the cracks in her facade. The tension in the room was suffocating, and the protagonist could feel the weight of the moment. "You have no right to do this," Karen suddenly shouted, her composure crumbling. "This is slander. I've worked too hard to let you destroy everything I've built." She stormed toward the protagonist, her hands trembling with fury. But before she could say another word, one of the board members spoke up, his voice thick with disbelief. "Is this true, Karen?" Karen's eyes darted to the board member, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words. But there were no words that could save her now. The truth was too powerful. The truth was undeniable. The board members exchanged looks, confused, shocked, and increasingly disgusted. They had no choice now but to confront the monster that had been hiding in their midst for so long. The protagonist stood tall, heart pounding, as the room erupted into whispers. It wasn't just about the DNA test anymore. It was about exposing Karen for the fraud she truly was. And the walls she'd spent years building were finally starting to crumble. The showdown had begun. The silence in the room was deafening as the HOA board members processed the evidence before them. The air was thick with the weight of the truth, the room so tense that it felt as though even the walls were holding their breath. The protagonists stood frozen at the front of the room, their heart racing as they watched Karen, who was now visibly shaking, her facade of control slipping with every passing second. "You can't," This isn't true. Karen's voice wavered, but she quickly regained some composure, her eyes darting to each board member, trying to gauge their reactions. Her usual smugness had been replaced with desperation, but it was too late. One of the board members, an older man named Mr. Lawson, who had always seemed more of a bystander than an active participant in HOA matters, stood up. His eyes flicked from the documents to Karen, and his voice, once steady, now carried a note of suspicion. "Karen, is this really true?" he asked, his voice growing firmer with each word. "These claims about you, about the funds, it's hard to ignore." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line as she tried to stammer out a response. "These are all lies, misunderstandings. People just trying to tear me down. I've been the one to keep this neighborhood together, not them." But the doubt was creeping into the board members' faces, and Karen could feel it. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one in control. The protagonist watched her carefully, each word and gesture showing how far Karen was slipping from the powerful position she once held. The manipulation, the lies, all of it, Karen's empire was crumbling. "Let's not be hasty," another board member, Mrs. Thorne, spoke up, her voice shaking as she glanced between Karen and the protagonist. "This is a serious accusation. We need to investigate this further before jumping to conclusions." But Mr. Lawson shook his head firmly. "Investigate. We already have the evidence. The claims are clear, and Karen has been cornered. No more pretending she's the innocent leader of this neighborhood." The tension that had gripped the room now began to shift. The other members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the wheels of doubt turning in their minds. The truth was spreading like wildfire, and Karen's attempts to control the situation were only making her look more guilty. Karen, realizing that her grip on the situation was slipping entirely, snapped, "You can't do this to me. You have no idea what you're messing with. I'll..." Before she could finish her outburst, another board member, Mr. Harris, interrupted, his voice sharp. "Enough, Karen. We've all had enough of your games." He turned toward the other board members, his voice gaining strength. "I say we vote right now. This has gone on long enough." The protagonist felt a rush of adrenaline as the board members exchanged wary glances. It was happening. Karen's reign was ending right before their eyes. With a heavy sigh, Mrs. Thorne finally nodded. "We'll hold a vote. This is too serious to ignore. Let's decide whether or not we want Karen to remain in charge of this HOA, or if we need to take action." As the board members began to make their decision, Karen stood frozen, her face a mixture of disbelief and growing rage. She had always been the one pulling the strings, the one calling the shots, but not anymore. The protagonist's pulse quickened as the room descended into an anxious quiet. Every second felt like an eternity. They knew this vote could either confirm their victory or push them to the edge, but they could already see the shift in the board's mood. The tide had turned. Karen, still trying to salvage what was left of her authority, turned to the protagonist with a venomous look. "You think you've won. You think you've beaten me. This isn't over." The protagonist stood tall, their voice steady, despite the storm of emotions inside. "You've been hiding behind lies for too long, Karen. It ends today." As the board members raised their hands to cast their votes, the protagonist's heart pounded. One by one, they voted to oust Karen from her position of power. And then the final blow came. Mrs. Thorne, her voice almost apologetic, spoke clearly. "We have no choice but to remove you from the HOA board, Karen." A stunned silence filled the room. Karen's face drained of color, and for the first time, the people who had once feared her saw her for who she truly was, a broken woman who had built her empire on manipulation and deceit. Her reign was over. But as she turned to leave, her eyes locked with the protagonist's one last time. Her lips curled into a thin, bitter smile. "This isn't the end," she whispered, a cold promise in her voice. "You've made a powerful enemy." The protagonist didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." The room was thick with the aftermath of the vote. The echoes of the board members' decision still lingered in the air, but the victory felt distant. The protagonist stood at the center of it all, heart racing, yet a strange sense of calm had settled over them. Karen was out. Her reign was officially over, or so they thought. As the board members began to murmur among themselves, Karen remained silent, her face now an emotionless mask. She had lost, and everyone could see it. But the predator wasn't gone yet. Her eyes still burned with fury, searching for any shred of power she could cling to. The protagonist took a step back, breathing in the rarefied air of victory, but the sting of uncertainty still hung in the air. Karen's chilling words, her final, whispered threat before she'd stormed out of the room, echoed in their mind. This isn't the end. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up, and the knot in their stomach tightened. Was this really over, or had they just entered a more dangerous phase of the battle? The protagonist's mother walked over, placing a hand on their shoulder. "You did it. You've exposed her. You've won." Her voice was steady, but the weariness in her eyes betrayed her. She knew that Karen's twisted nature wasn't going to vanish just because the board had voted her out. "I hope so," the protagonist replied quietly, glancing over at their father, who was still deep in conversation with a few of the board members. "But I can't shake the feeling that Karen isn't done. She's too dangerous to just walk away quietly." "Well, she doesn't have any control anymore. She's been stripped of her position," Mrs. Thorne said, her voice a little too hopeful, her eyes still lingering on the door where Karen had exited. "She'll have to accept this. The community won't stand for her antics any longer." But just as she spoke those words, a loud, unmistakable sound rang out. A crash, followed by a sharp thud coming from the hallway. The protagonist's heart jumped. It was coming from the front entrance. They exchanged a look with their parents before they all rushed to the source of the noise. As they reached the hallway, they saw Karen standing in the doorway, her face twisted in a mask of rage. She had barged back in through the front entrance, a crowbar clenched in her shaking hand. The weapon was a symbol of her desperation, her need to reclaim control, even if it meant tearing everything down in the process. "You think you've won," she spat, eyes wild. "You think the neighborhood is just going to forget everything I've done for them. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Before anyone could react, Karen raised the crowbar, her movements erratic, almost animalistic. In that moment, the protagonist saw just how far she was willing to go, not just to win, but to destroy. "Get out of here, Karen," one of the board members shouted, stepping forward, but Karen swung the crowbar toward him, narrowly missing him and smashing into the wall behind him. The whole room froze, panic seizing everyone for a brief moment. But the protagonist felt a fire rise inside them. They'd already beaten Karen once, and they weren't about to let her tear everything apart now. "Enough," the protagonist yelled, stepping forward and glaring at Karen. "You've lost. It's over. You can't intimidate anyone anymore." Karen paused, her eyes narrowing, her grip tightening around the crowbar. "You don't know who you're messing with. I will make sure you regret this." The room was thick with tension as Karen's fury battled with her sense of defeat. But the protagonist, despite the pounding of their heart and the sudden surge of adrenaline, stood their ground. Karen raised the crowbar again, her teeth gritted, but this time, the protagonist didn't hesitate. They stepped forward, blocking the path, the moment hanging between a final confrontation and the threat of a complete collapse. The board members, finally seeing Karen for what she truly was, unhinged, rushed forward, wresting the crowbar from her grasp. As Karen struggled, her face contorted with rage and frustration, the protagonist's father stepped up beside them, eyes steely. "It's over, Karen. You've lost. Get out." Karen's wild eyes met the protagonist's one last time, a flicker of madness flashing before she was restrained. "You think you've beaten me," she hissed. "I'll make sure your family never feels safe again. You'll regret this." And just like that, Karen was dragged out, leaving only the echo of her words behind. The protagonist stood there, breathing heavily, but the sense of victory had never been clearer. Karen was gone, defeated, exposed, and stripped of her power. For now, at least. But deep down, the protagonist knew that her final words weren't just empty threats. There was more to come. Karen wasn't going to go quietly. The fight was over, but the war had just begun. The sound of Karen's shrieking voice echoed down the hallway as she was dragged from the building, her face twisted in a final expression of rage and disbelief. The door slammed shut behind her, but the air inside the HOA meeting room was still thick with tension. The protagonists stood frozen in place, their pulse hammering in their ears, watching the chaotic scene fade behind them. It's over, right? But even as they thought it, a voice inside them whispered that this wasn't the final chapter, not by a long shot. They had seen the fire in Karen's eyes, the unhinged desperation that was far from over. Karen wasn't someone who just vanished. The protagonist had seen too much of that manic hunger to believe she would simply give up. "That was insane," Mrs. Thorne finally said, breaking the silence. Her hands shook as she clasped them together, clearly still in shock from the outburst. "We can't let our guard down," the protagonist said, their voice steady, despite the turmoil churning inside. "Karen might be gone for now, but I don't think she'll let it go so easily." Their father nodded gravely. "She's dangerous when cornered. We need to stay vigilant." But even as they spoke, a strange unease lingered. The vote had been the right thing to do, they knew that. But something felt off. The weight in their chest, the knot in their stomach. This wasn't over. As the board members began to leave the room, murmuring among themselves about the chaos they'd just witnessed, the protagonists stepped aside to collect their thoughts. Their phone buzzed in their pocket, pulling them from their reverie. With a sigh, they pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a message from an unknown number. "You think you've won? Think again. The game's only just begun. I have things you'll never understand. Enjoy your victory while it lasts. I'll be back." The words sent a chill down their spine. Karen wasn't just angry. She was playing a long game. Her message wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The protagonist's hands tightened around the phone. They had underestimated her. They thought that once Karen was out of the picture, it would be over. But this felt like the beginning of something far more dangerous than they could have imagined. The message was clear. Karen wasn't done. "What is it?" their mother asked, noticing the change in their expression. The protagonist swallowed hard, holding the phone tightly in their hand. "It's from Karen," they said, voice barely above a whisper. "She's not finished. She's going to come for us." Their father, who had been quietly watching the interaction, stepped forward, his face serious. "Then we need to be prepared." The realization settled in, a dark truth they hadn't wanted to face. Even though Karen was gone from the HOA, she wasn't going to let go of the power she'd so carefully cultivated. Her fury wasn't something that could be extinguished with a vote or a few pieces of evidence. It would fester, and it would find a way to break free. "She's a mastermind," the protagonist muttered, shaking their head in disbelief. "She knows how to play people, how to manipulate situations. We've only seen a small part of what she's capable of." "But we've exposed her," Mrs. Thorne said, her voice uncertain but still hopeful. "People know the truth now. She can't hide behind the lies anymore." "Don't be so sure," the protagonist replied, their gaze hardening. "Karen's already planning her next move, and it's going to be worse than anything we've seen." They turned and walked toward the door, their parents close behind. As they left the meeting room, they saw the other neighbors milling about, discussing the aftermath. It was hard to take in all the shock, the disbelief, the sense that the neighborhood was changing. But that same unsettling feeling gnawed at them. The battle was won, but the war was still on. As they left the building, the protagonist's phone buzzed again. This time, the message was even more cryptic. "You should have listened to me. You're just a pawn in this game. And the queen. She always has the last move." The protagonists stared at the screen, their breath catching in their throat. A pawn. A game. Karen's words felt like a web closing in on them, tightening around their chest. She had always been 5 steps ahead, and they were just beginning to realize the full scope of her manipulation. The moment of victory, once so sweet, now tasted bitter. The game wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And the protagonist had no idea just how deep Karen's influence went, how far her reach extended beyond the confines of the HOA. As they stepped out into the cool night air, the world around them felt eerily quiet, the calm before the storm. This time, Karen wasn't coming back as the villain they had faced before. She was coming back as a force of nature, a storm they couldn't outrun.